Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Aaron Sumner. Based in Astoria, Oregon, Aaron has over 2 decades of experience as a software developer and is currently a senior software engineer at O'Reilly Media. You can follow him on Twitter at Ruralocity and check out his website at aaronsumner.com. And you can read his blog and sign up for his newsletter at everydayrails.com, as well as follow the Twitter account for the blog at everydayrails. Aaron is the author of the LeanPub book, Everyday Rails Testing with RSpec, a practical approach to test-driven development. In this interview, we're going to talk about Aaron's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a self-published author. So thank you, Aaron, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in software development.
Sure. So I grew up in a rural area outside of St. Louis, Missouri, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River. And we got our first computer in the classroom when I was in 4th grade. So that maybe puts a date on me a little bit. It was one of those Radio Shack computers that you hook up to a TV and you're off to the races. And I started to learn to program on that, and never really. It was just kind of something that I did on the side, just kind of for fun, to make graphics or make really terrible games or something like that. And then when I was at the University of Kansas for my undergraduate, was right when the web was taking off as a thing. And so I remember there were the main computer center, where the upstairs was where there were computer labs with Macs and PCs, and people could type up their papers or whatever, because most people didn't have a computer at home yet even. But then downstairs where all the mainframes were, and the servers and things like that. And all of a sudden, everybody had to have an email account, and there was a line outside the door of this building of people just waiting to get their first university email account. And so I was there finishing up school as this was all just kind of taking off, and just kind of wound up going in that direction instead of my undergraduate degree is in journalism. And I never really formally did anything with it. I wound up hooking up with some people who were doing some interesting things in research, in education, that they had a lot of stuff they wanted to do on the web. So I went to work with them, and just kind of learned on the job as I went, learned some Perl, and then that led to Java and PHP, and eventually to Ruby. And I worked with that group off and on for probably close to 15 years. I kind of left a couple times for short stints elsewhere, but always wound up back with them. And then in 2013, I was at RailsConf in Portland, and saw a flyer on the job board that O'Reilly Media was looking for a Rails developer. And I've always, that was one of those publishers that I always admired. I had the big thick Perl book that I spent money on, a book instead of beer in college, and bought that. And so I always kind of held them in high regard, and knew one of the editors there and asked him, "You think I should apply?" And he said, "Yeah." So I did. The plan was to move out to California for that. That wound up, for personal reasons at the time, I couldn't do that. Wound up, they made it a remote position. So I started my first 5 years there working from Kansas. And then last year I moved out to Oregon, seamless from a work standpoint. And yeah, so I work on the back end for O'Reilly's conferences. So like if you've ever attended like OSCON or the Software Architecture Conference, some of the older conferences like Velocity and Fluent, which was the web conference. If you ever spoke there or registered to attend or sponsored, you used our software for that.
Thank you for sharing that great story. It's a couple of things in there I'd like to talk about. One of which is something you said pretty quickly about when people get into. In the olden days, when you got into programming, one of the things you might do is do graphics. And it's funny, I think for a lot of people who aren't dated the way you and I are, that sounds funny. And, so just to spell out the example, it reminded me of a very clear image I had of a friend's older brother who spent hours and hours and hours typing in basically each pixel to make a Detroit Red Wings logo appear on the screen. And there was something at the time very magical about being able to type a command and see something happen right before your eyes. And people really, it was so magical that people really would spend hours and hours and hours just like defining the color for like each pixel on a screen individually.
Yeah, I remember that I designed my own baseball cards for players that I liked as a kid. And, they were terrible, super low res. You had to have a really good imagination to say, oh, yeah, that's who that is. But I had fun doing it. And, it led to bigger and better things.
And so what led you to study journalism at university?
It was kind of just a little bit of happenstance. The journalism program where I attended at the University of Kansas was and is highly regarded, and my focus was in advertising. And the reason I went that route was it was it's a good mix of a lot of different things like writing and design and psychology and the sales part I wasn't always great at, but there was some sales aspect to it. So some like person-to-person interaction type stuff. And I liked that it combined all these things in like a practical way where I could graduate and go get a job and not like, okay, I've got a liberal arts degree. What now? This is before you could kind of dovetail that into a software career or things like that. Like my friends who had overlap because they were like maybe English majors or literature wound up going into call centers right out of school, and that didn't sound appealing to me. They've gone on to great things since then, but at the time I was like, I want to get done with school and get out and start doing something.
And so you're a self-taught programmer?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I won't pretend that I didn't have some great people along the way kind of guiding me along, but I've taken maybe 2 computer classes, and one of them was super, super like intro. I could have taught the class. I don't want to sound like I'm bragging about it, but it was like my last semester in school where I had my capstone project. It's going to be taking all of my time, but I needed some hours to fill in. So yeah, I took like intro to computing, which was like, this is a mouse and this is how you use it. And again, dating myself a little bit where some of those things were new to people, but I admit I did that just because I needed some hours that would not take too many brain cycles from my capstone work.
It's really interesting how things have changed with regard to that even in the last 10 years, but with things like Khan Academy and MOOCs and being able to learn online and things like Stack Overflow and even Google itself have changed the way people learn things. And back in those days when you were learning, it was literally go to the bookstore and get a book on something, and if there wasn't a book on that something there, then you maybe checked another bookstore or borrowed a copy from a friend or something like that, and people would actually, this is how you learned how to do it. In addition to the trial and error and community that you could develop like kind of in person with people, you really like the resources that were available were incredibly diminished compared to what we have nowadays.
Right. It was books, or you go into a university program and spend 4 years learning something and then still have to buy the books to know how to do it on the web.
Yeah, so that's actually the question I wanted to ask you next is related to that. So, and this comes up pretty frequently on this podcast, but do you regret not having studied computer science in university? Do you wish you had done that?
There are some things that I wish I had a little bit of a better grounding in at times. Like there are maybe some things around, say, really digging in deep to algorithms or something like that. I'm not one to just like sit down and have a deep discussion with a fellow engineer about which algorithm is best, or what do you think about, I don't know. But there are things that if I need to learn it, I know enough to know how to find what I need to learn and learn what I need and then apply it. But I've never had to understand things just for the purely theoretical reason for understanding it theoretically, like you would maybe in a university program. And I don't regret that. There are times where knowing this algorithm instead of this one would make something a little bit faster. And that's where it's good to know. But that sort of thing is increasingly getting abstracted away from us. I think where somebody much smarter than I am has figured that out and made it so it's easy for me to apply to my problem.
Speaking of your problems, before we move on to the next part of the interview and talk about your writing, I wanted to ask you about your work for O'Reilly. So you said you work on the back end of the conference side of things. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are more or less in the tech world and they're familiar with O'Reilly. And I'm certainly curious, what kind of work do you do on a day-to-day? What are some of the problems or projects that you work on conference tech?
So like I mentioned, the app that handles pretty much everything that at least handles the back end of a lot of it. A lot of the parts of it are moving out to standalone front end applications. But the back end that processes everything. So whether it's so let's kind of start from the top ish, where the planners at O'Reilly have decided, okay, there's going to be this event, OSCON 2020 in Portland or whatever, and the call for proposals opens on this date and runs through this date. So the system for that is on our back end. And so then you decide, okay, I've got a great idea. I want to talk about open source in self-publishing or something like that. And I want to submit that talk. So you go in and submit your proposal. That goes through our system. Fast forward a little bit to where the proposals are up and you decide, I want to attend this event. So going in and registering and saying, which package do I want? Some of them might have extra tutorials or workshops that you have access to versus just attending the regular, 30, 40-minute sessions. So going in and registering, this handles that. Lots of reporting on the back end for how many people need vegetarian meals versus regular meals. Soup to nuts. It's
So you said soup to nuts, and I saw on your profile on LinkedIn that you also work on security initiatives.
I do. So the engineering department is broken up into teams that work on their own parts of, conferences is one part of everything that the company does. And we all have representatives that meet on a team regularly to kind of discuss both high-level security initiatives and what we're doing on a team-by-team basis. So I do a lot in terms of education within the department about best practices, and then just making sure that the software that we ship is as secure as we know how to make it.
So this isn't like the security of the conference, like keeping bad guys out or something like that.
Oh no, we have professionals who kind of I think the venues provide that level of security. I fortunately don't have to show up and look tough.
And so moving on to the next part of the interview, so you eventually started writing a blog. How did that come about?
So the blog predated the book and was one of those things where I learned a lot from the Rails community in particular. I was pretty well ingrained in Ruby at this point and started thinking about what are some ways that I can contribute back to this community. And I was noticing, so I was involved in a small local meetup where I was living at the time in Kansas. And there were some of us who were doing Ruby development. Some people were doing PHP, some people a lot of people doing Python. Django came out of Lawrence, Kansas, where I have lived a good while. So we would all get together and just kind of talk shop, And there were a couple people in particular who were a little newer to Rails than I was at that point, and would ask questions and I would answer them. And I kind of realized, if this is helping one or two people here, maybe it would help a few more people if I put it online. So that's how the blog kind of came to be. It was inspired a lot by what Ryan Bates did with Railscasts, which was a weekly video service you'd have 5-ish to 10-ish minute long videos where we would talk about here's how to use this library to do authentication with your Rails app, or whatever little piece of functionality. And he probably built up like 400 or 500 episodes and then called it quits after a while. But I wanted to do something like that, except more in traditional blog form, where I could write more than talk, and list out code and just try to find ways to help people who maybe weren't as far along with it as I was at that point. So yeah, it started that, I don't even know the date anymore, maybe 9 years ago or so at this point, and built a little following. And yeah, I don't write there as much as I used to, but every now and then, if there's something that interests me that I think other people might be interested in, I'll write something up there.
And one thing that you've written about quite a bit is testing, software testing. And you actually, one of your more recent posts was how to do test-driven development when test-driven development is hard. And we might be talking a little bit about TDD in a bit. But for those who imagine you're talking to someone who, and as I'm sure you sometimes do, who's totally unfamiliar with how the computer goes. What is software testing? How does that work?
So the way I like to describe it is, imagine you're building up some software kind of bit by bit, and the first few features you can open up what you're working on in your web browser or on a simulation phone or wherever the end platform is, and you can click around a little bit and you can see, okay, yeah, I think this is working. And what if I type a really long string in here? Oops, that broke. Okay, I can fix that. And I can go back and reload it. And okay, now that works. On to the next little bit of functionality for my software. And that works pretty well when you're starting out. But over time, that doesn't scale. Where as you add each thing, not only do you have to test that new thing, but you have to go back and manually test all those other things to make sure that the new thing didn't break something that you wrote 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. So the first win with software testing is it helps you automate that sort of thing. So you can test all that in seconds rather than minutes or hours or days. And then
and let's just maybe have a concrete example here. So the way I was introduced to software testing when I joined Lean Pub was I'm the sort of resident non-technical person, and so it's like all the programmers have done something, Len, go break it. And so I was always working with things from the user's side. So it's like if we created a new feature that when you click a button, X thing is supposed to happen. So I would go click that button and see if X happened and see if X happened properly. And I got pretty good at this. I'm never formally trained or anything like that, but just like I call it cowboy testing. And in a way it's a kind of fun challenge, especially if you didn't build the code yourself, so you're not embarrassed if something breaks. But I think what you're talking about is quite a bit different from that.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is definitely an important part of it, where it's good to have that second set of eyes, just kind of looking at everything before something goes off into the wild, and you have real customers paying you money for something that you don't want it to not work for them. But what the automation starts to give you is more of a rapid feedback loop. So instead of me writing a little bit of code or writing a bunch of code and saying, okay, Lynn, here it is for you to test. And you find something that, had I known about it a week ago, would have been a quick fix. But I've piled up so much more stuff on top of that that fix is going to be another 2 weeks, versus automation where I can really quickly iterate through finding those things that are wrong or that look right, but as soon as I say, oh, but it also needs to validate that an email address is valid or whatever. Oh, I need to go in and fix that. So it really tightens up that loop and helps the person writing the code do a lot more quickly. And then as you kind of get comfortable with the tooling, write it more efficiently in terms of from your head to the keys to the screen, on down to being designed better from an architectural standpoint.
It's really interesting how the role that culture plays in things, in how software gets developed. And one of the reasons I like to talk about this in depth in these interviews is that, software has eaten the world. Mm-hmm. Everything you do has software behind it. And so the culture behind how that software was made matters just as much as the culture behind the company that built the bridge that you drive over every day. Mm-hmm. And I was interviewing a computer science professor once who talked about how we're sort of still in the, like, people have been programming for decades and decades now, but imagine if you were only 70 years into the medical profession or something like that. And one great image I like to bring up in that, he talked about how, like, we're only now kind of at the point where we're learning you need to disinfect before you operate. Mm-hmm. And the image I like to give of that is that, how in a normal man's suit, there are still buttons on the sleeves, often even if you can't unbutton the sleeves. Those are from when surgeons wanted to be able to unbutton their coat to roll up their sleeves. Oh. So they could operate and not get blood on their sleeves. But of course, that you shouldn't be operating in the coat that you just came from lunch with, and it took people a long time to learn that for all kinds of really basic, complex reasons, actually. But so test-driven development is the idea that you should be testing as you go. And it can actually be really, that can actually be really hard to convince someone to do, like, let's say a superior, because it slows down the development, at least in the local sense.
It can, especially up front. There's a quote that I like, and I think it's from Kent Beck, but I'm not certain now. But the notion of slowing down to go fast. I think it's just like anything. Like I remember when I was learning how to drive a car, and I was out on a country road, and I was maybe braking 7 miles an hour, and I just thought I was just zipping down at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It just kind of felt like everything was going by so fast. And I'm sure the instructor was just rolling his eyes as I was creeping along there and super timid. But as you get comfortable with how the wheel feels in your hand and how much you have to turn it to go this far left, or how hard you have to hit the gas or the brake or whatever, you get more efficient with it. And it eventually gets to something where you don't even think about it a whole lot. You're just, okay, I need to go to the grocery store, get in my car, and then 5 minutes later I'm there. And for better or worse, you may not even remember how you got there. But I think that testing is similar, where when you're newer to it, there are two ways you can go about it. One, you can sit there with a blank screen and say, okay, I know I need to write a test first, but I don't know what I'm supposed to write. But the same could be said for, I've got a blank screen with software that's supposed to do something, and I know it's supposed to add up to 45, but I don't know how to write the code to make it add up to 45, or to make this cool animation on a web browser or whatever. With testing over time, as you get to know the tools, you can say, okay, I know that it's supposed to be 45. Now let's kind of back up and think about, okay, what are my inputs that they're going to take, that I'm going to bring in? So whether that's 9 times 5 or whatever. And then how do I say, okay, bring this in, make this happen, and then the result of that should be 45, or whatever, the order is complete, or the markdown has been rendered into a PDF, or whatever it might be. The testing and the coding just start to kind of interweave with each other, where you're writing a little bit of test and a little bit of code and a little bit of test and a little bit of code. And that's where you're talking about those feedback loops that gets a lot more rapid. So I can see, yes, I'm on the right track because the test tells me I'm on the right track rather than, okay, I wrote a bunch of code and say, okay, Lynn, could you test this for me? And
Yeah,
I have to wait hours for you to get back to me or because you're busy. And
yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the feedback loop because I think at least one way of developing software that was in the past conventional, probably is now, was to have you would have maybe a non-technical executive sitting on top of a bunch of managers that report to him or her, and those managers might not be technical, but then they've got like buckets of activity that they have categorized. So, for example, there's the person who writes the code, and then conventionally there's actually it's a separate group of people that test the code, and so a bunch of people might write some code, give that code to the manager who then goes and gives it to the, I mean, I'm just putting this in a kind of cartoonish way, but like
sure,
has to go and then give it to a bunch of people whose only job is to test that code. And then this can create an adversarial relationship between the coders and the testers. And it can also create a sense of hierarchy in the organization where the person who's doing the testing is lower down than the person who's doing the actual coding. And so combining these processes overcomes, in order to combine these processes, you often have to overcome a lot of institutional practices that are baked into just even the organizational structure itself.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've been lucky to work with some really great like QA type testers like that, where the work that we do up front as developers to kind of check our own work as we go kind of makes sure that their time is going to be better spent. They're not going to be finding silly errors. They're going to be if they find something, it's because, oh wow, we didn't even think about that. That's a really it's a weird case, but it's legitimate enough that we need to address that before we take this live. We're not just kind of saying, okay, here's some code, and oh, you spelled the company's name wrong here, to like use a really simplistic example, but yeah, I think it makes every step of the process more efficient over time, and makes sure that the people doing that traditional testing, like you described, are really testing things that matter and not just testing to make sure that we spell their names right.
Speaking of testing, you had a line that I really enjoyed from a blog post that I think you published in June. The line goes, "Who here remembers when we had to make sure everything still worked with some shitty old version of Internet Explorer?"
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What has changed such that you no longer need to test to make sure everything works with some shitty old version of Internet Explorer?
Unfortunately, I think we're getting back to that stage where there are browser differences, and I don't do as much front end development as I used to, but for a long stretch, libraries like jQuery, which is a JavaScript library that was and really is still very popular across the web to do some work so that I write my interactivity with jQuery, and then jQuery does the work to make sure that it compiles down in such a way that Internet Explorer can work with it properly, and Google Chrome and Firefox, and not just the current Firefox, but maybe a Firefox a few years old. The good news is some of those really, really old versions of Internet Explorer they're so far in the minority now that you probably don't have to worry about them, but there was a time where they were just a thing. So I know that a lot of people who really focus on front end work and libraries like jQuery and now React and Vue.js, and there's a new JavaScript library every week. So I know that when you use them correctly, you have to worry about that less, that it's going to work differently in this browser than this browser. The nice thing with testing, to bring it back to the automated testing, though, is a lot of that is automatable now. So I can say, okay, run through this scenario through Firefox. Okay, now this time run it through IE 11 or Safari or whatever, and find those issues a lot quicker than you would if you had to have 12 browsers on your computer and go through each one of those one at a time.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting to to date ourselves once again. In the olden days, when you got an internet browser, you bought it, and it might have come on a disk, and then you would put that disk into your machine, and then you would install the program, and that was the program you had. They didn't update. If you wanted an update, you had to go buy a new disk and come back and put it in your computer and put that on there. And so what would happen in the sort of not even just the early days, but in when the internet started, when the World Wide Web started becoming very popular and things like commerce started to happen on it, people would be like, "Hey, I tried to make a purchase on your website and it didn't work," and then you'd have to ask them, well, then we still do that these days when we people who run e-commerce sites, but still, if someone had an old version of an internet browser, then either they couldn't use your site or you had to do something to make it so that it was compatible with that browser. But nowadays, when I use Chrome mostly, and I see a little arrow when I need to update Chrome, or when I have the opportunity to update Chrome, and I can just click that and do it. I mean, I'm not a web developer, but when I read your line about the shitty old version of Internet Explorer, that's what I thought about. And so one of the answers to someone saying, something on your site isn't working, nowadays we can say, well, click the update button, and you'll be fine. It's something that you couldn't do before. So it's kind of like the solution is on the other end now.
Yeah, it is definitely a lot easier. It does kind of now we're kind of instead of the shitty old version, now it's the shiny new version. Like, oh, there's this new feature in Chrome that breaks this one weird thing that we were doing, but ideally the tooling is in place to make that fixable and not best used on Firefox version, this exact version, or
yeah. Well, it brings. I mean, updates bring their own hell with them too, right? So, for example, it's like, oh, I clicked the update button because I associate the word update with improvement, and now half my apps don't work.
Right.
And this is the sort of like sweaty finger of death when you go to click the button to update your operating system. You're like, what is going to happen? Because I know a bunch of settings are going to change on me. I know there are going to be things that I can't work. I mean, I work on a Mac, and I get these periodic warnings like, yeah, your operating system doesn't work with this app anymore, or won't work optimally. What does that mean? Click here to learn more, and it's like, what am I going to learn? Like, that I'm fine.
Sorry. Yeah. Oops.
Yeah. So moving on to talk about your book. So there you had this, you started writing this blog and it was doing well, and then you decided to make a book out of it. And it's been, I should say, I think you published the first version on LeanPub in 2012, and this has been one of our more successful books over time. So it's been a long time that we've been looking forward to talking to you. You decided, well, actually, I guess the first question I should ask is, why did you decide to publish the book in progress?
So I had started this series on test-driven development, and it was specifically on how I learned to do it. Because we've talked about it. I don't have a formal background in a lot of this, and I was kind of learning it as I went. And I knew that TDD was seen as valuable within the Rails community in particular, maybe more than it was in other software communities at the time. So I knew I need to figure this out. And I'd read a lot of books, and there wasn't one book where I just, okay, I've got it now. I just kind of kept reading and building on it, reading it, building on it. And so what I did was just kind of made the decision to just start simple. So I'm gonna start my testing at the smallest little atoms of code that I can. Really test things that are super obvious that I really probably don't need to test, but just to kind of get familiar with the flow, I'm going to write tests for that. I'm going to do it against code that I'm pretty sure already works because, it's been through the slow click, click, click browser testing. It's been in production for a while, so real users are using it. So if this were a bug, I would know it. So then that way, if I'm writing a test and it doesn't work, I can probably blame the test and not say, well, there's something wrong with the code. So I started there, and then I would, as I got comfortable with that one little piece, I would build out to more and more complex chunks of code, different scenarios, on up to, rather than just saying, okay, just test this one little 5-line bit of code that's around order processing or whatever. I want to test the entire order process. So going to the site, selecting the book, adding it to my cart, saying I want to pay, enter my credit card, click the button, make sure I get the email, make sure that email has a link to download the book, just as an example there. So building up that way rather than just feeling like I have to know everything at once. And it really worked for me. And so I started writing about that. And I was, I think at the time I thought, well, this would be maybe a 4-5 part blog series and I'll call it good. But about 3 posts in, I was getting really good traction. Like not just the regulars that I knew were coming to check out my site whenever I had new stuff, but it was getting picked up elsewhere, and I was getting a lot of new people. And I had recently heard about LeanPub at that point, just kind of as a little side conversation, and I thought, I'm going to try it. And the strike while the iron's hot. It's got really good traction right now, and I'm just going to see how hard it would be to take these 4 blog posts I've got right now and turn it into a book. And from a technical standpoint, it turns out LeanPub makes that very easy. And because I was already in Markdown, so I just copied the files over, had to tweak a few things, and like a few hours later, I had something there and just said, okay, it's not done, but if you want to buy it, kind of support the work. I don't know what to charge, so $9. And I figured maybe I'd sell a few copies, maybe 100. And I hate to say I don't even know how many copies. I think maybe around 6,500 at this point. But it really took off quickly. And there were a few people who were like, oh, this isn't done. I want my money back. But by and large, people are like, oh, this is great. Keep it up. Have you thought about including this? And sometimes it'd be like, yeah, that's a great idea. I'll add that, because now it was beyond those 4 blog posts. It was, how can I make this into something that is worth the money that people are buying? And so, that's how it came to be.
Thanks for sharing that. It's actually really interesting. We're getting into the weeds a little bit, and this sort of typically happens when we're nearing the sort of last part of the interview, where we talk about the practical experience of being a writer, and particularly a self-published author. You mentioned that you didn't get too many people saying, "Oh, I bought this book and it's unfinished," and I just wanted to remark on that, because it's really interesting, because you've been around on LeanPub since the early days. When LeanPub started, the idea of in-progress publishing a nonfiction book was very unfamiliar to people. Mm-hmm. People were familiar with serial publishing of novels from the 19th century, although that had actually sort of fallen out of public awareness. So I guess even in fiction at the time, it might have been, this book is only 3 chapters in. But we basically don't get anybody saying that anymore. People are familiar with the idea, and of mm-hmm. course, we've also learned better how to communicate and things like that. Put a progress bar under the book, things that seem obvious. But it's actually very rare that we get someone who doesn't notice that the book is unfinished and is surprised. Mm-hmm. And then it's even more rare for someone to not notice that it's unfinished, be surprised, and then be unhappy about it. Mm-hmm. The idea has just caught on. And people get it.
I totally agree. And what I've found is, as people have kind of gotten used to the idea, not only are they just used to the idea of something being 50% done or whatever, but they're more open to saying, oh, I found this issue, whether it's a simple typo or I typed in this code and it didn't work. Sometimes it's, oh, I didn't explain that very well. So if I reframe it like this, that helps explain it better. Or other times it's like, oh yeah, I screwed that up. Let me fix that. And, thank you very much. And, the next version has that corrected.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to watch, not only for us, but for our authors as well, to see the change over time. And the, in our early days, the idea of an author interacting with a reader terrified a lot of authors, and intimidated readers. But over time, it's become, people just we've got an email the author link on the landing page for the book, and people just click it with abandon, and people have learned how to be polite about it.
Yep.
They've learned how to, on both sides. People have, and once a reader realizes that they can actually help improve a book, like there's a typo on page 92. It's very exciting when they communicate that to an author, get a response, and then see the change in the next version of the book. And the days we never actually really heard this speculation all that much, probably because so many LeanPub books are programming books, and programmers collaborate all the time and like to help each other out all the time. But there's never been a kind of jealousy, like why would I just go and help someone else with their book? We basically never encountered any of that. Once people realized we were facilitating this kind of interaction, the idea clicks, and then when you sort of dip your toe in the water, but when you start as a reader communicating with authors and vice versa, it can become this really rewarding experience, and that makes everybody happy. And so one thing I wanted to ask you about was, I'm going to ask you about your cover in just a moment, but you set up a GitHub repo for your sample code, and you invited people to give feedback there. So have you had an experience of getting pull requests from people that help you improve things?
So it's a little bit weird in that it's not pull request driven. I do use the issue tracker on the sample code is in the repo, but not the book's contents. The book's contents I keep separate, and I keep that private just so I can. My writing process can be a little messy sometimes, and there's only so much of that I need to share with the world, I think. But the translators I've worked with have access to it, and that's what eventually feeds to LeanPub for new books once it's polished up a little bit. But the public repo is the sample code, and it's structured so that you can check out a branch at a time to go through each chapter. So check out the previous chapter if you're starting at the beginning of chapter 2, or check out chapter 2 if you want to see how things looked for me once I got everything together. But then GitHub also has issue tracking. And so that's where I send people to go and say, I found a typo, even if it's like not in the sample code, but it's like somewhere in the book. That's a good way for me to have a central place to keep track of those. And then as I fix them in the next iteration, just go off and say, okay, thanks, this is fixed in the September 2018 edition or whatever, and mark those off as I go. And I think part of it being a programming book, a lot of people are familiar with GitHub anyway, so they know how to file issues on an open source project and have that dialogue about, can you tell me more about your setup? I can't get this to fail the way you did, and it's because I'm using this operating system or this database or whatever. And it's okay, that helps me out, and I can go from there. Every now and then I have somebody who, for whatever reason, either can't access GitHub. I don't know if there's maybe some limitations in some countries. I'm not sure. Or maybe they're just a little shy and they'll email me. And, a lot of times what I'll do then is I'll just post the issue myself on GitHub so other people can see it. So if you came along and found that same typo, you could go and say, oh, that's already being worked on, so I'm not going to worry about it, or I'm going to +1 it or whatever.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that process. That's really helpful to people who are planning their own projects to hear about the experiences other people have had and the ways they've used the tools that are available to them and the conventions that are available to them out there. So the cover for your book, which I mentioned just briefly, is a cool old red farm truck. It's a really good cover. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you chose that particular photo.
I sometimes think I way overthought the cover. At one point, I kind of visualized, and this was, when I was at a previous job and was just kind of in a different frame of mind around so much was new and it was all like so exciting. And okay, I'm going to write 50 books. And I was trying to think around a theme, like O'Reilly has the animal covers and like Manning has their own style, and all the kind of mainstream publishers have you can see that cover and say, oh, that's who published that book. I wanted to have something similar for a series of books around software, probably primarily Ruby, which is where the red came in. And I was searching around on a stock photography site, kind of came up with maybe 6 different cover ideas. And I have a friend who's a graphic designer by trade, and kind of worked through the ideas with him and explained what I was thinking of at the time in terms of this kind of being a series at some point. And so that's where we headed with the truck. I have an old truck. It's not that old, and I don't leave it parked in a field like that. But that kind of resonated with me as well. So yeah, the series of books with other, I don't know if they would have been vehicles or what, hasn't come to pass yet. But that was the origin behind the book cover.
Thanks for sharing that. It is a really great cover, and people sometimes joke about book covers, but it actually is really important to try and find a good one, and more importantly, even as importantly, one that you're happy with.
Yeah.
And so we've talked about your English language book, but you have a translation into Japanese of the same book, and that's something I wanted to talk to you about, because for a lot of people, if you've written a whole book, there's a lot in one language. There are a lot of other languages in the world and whole audiences you can reach in those languages, but actually getting a translation done can be a tricky thing. So can you tell us the story about how your translation came about and how the process worked for you?
Yeah. So there was a Chinese translation before the Japanese one, which was just kind of somebody approached me and asked if they could do it. Had some credentials in that they had done translation work for Michael Hartle, who wrote the Ruby on Rails tutorial that is kind of like the gospel of Ruby on Rails tutorials. And so with that, I said, yeah, let's do it. And so that translation happened, and didn't hear a whole lot more after that. And, it is what it is. But kind of following not too long after that, a small team of people from Japan said we'd like to do the same thing. And, Ruby, or Japan, is the birthplace of Ruby, and it would be really neat to have that. And so just like you said, it's there are people in Japan or many countries who either speak English fluently or speak enough to be able to piece together, okay, this is what this piece of code means. But to have it in the native language alongside the code can do a lot more to help people understand it. And I don't know Japanese or Chinese, or I know English okay, so I said, yeah, let's do it. And with that team in particular, it's been such an amazing experience. We've talked about people submitting issues on GitHub when they find typos or something in the book doesn't make sense. I think there's an extra level of thinking through that when you're having to not just make sense of something, but take something that makes sense in English and make it make sense in a totally different language. And so they found so many things that in some cases it was, a bug in the code or a simple typo, but a lot of times it was, this does not make sense to me. This paragraph, what did you mean? And I'll go back and read it a few months later, and I don't know what I meant. It used that opportunity to continually improve the product of the book. And that team in particular has been really great to work with. Kind of continuing on with the iterations of the book as they've continued over the years. They're right there to apply the changes to the Japanese version, and they always find new things with each iteration, and we fix them, and everybody's content. And
did they sign a contract with you, the team?
No, we did it really informally. With the translations I've done so far, the people doing the translators keep the royalties on the translated version. I maintain rights for whatever that's worth. I mean, if somebody said, "Well, I'm just going to keep on doing it," I don't have a team of attorneys in Japan to make them stop. But I kind of feel like it's better to get the thing out there than really worry about that too much. They've been cool about. There's been a few times where I go, we just want to thank you for all the work you did. Here's an Amazon gift certificate or something like that, which it's not something I asked for, so it was a nice little surprise. But yeah, for the most part, I've never hired an editor to help me out with this. So the things that they've found and have helped me improve, I think have more than paid for what they're keeping in royalties rather than me taking a cut of that. I think everybody probably has a different way they want to go about something like that, but it's worked well for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's such a great story. And just one thing I wanted to remark on is that in the publishing world, translation is a fraught thing. When you're talking about the world of traditional publishing, where like there's a company that's the publisher that will do all kinds of negotiating for like language rights to a book. And I really believe that one of the reasons you often hear about authors are having a hard time making money from their writing is all these incredibly complex conventions that exist around, that people think have to exist around doing certain things. A lot of those things don't have to exist. Your translators have made a great book, and they've made a fair amount of money, and they've made that book available to an audience that wouldn't have been able to, improve their professional careers if it weren't for that translation. And it was all done without needing to license regional rights or anything like that. And it's often a sort of classic example for me is people who spend a lot. I just wrote about this recently in a post about DRM. But, there are authors who will sit there worried about piracy and, thinking about how can we resolve this? Well, let's get the EU to change all their laws and then apply them globally so that, my book doesn't get copied. And it's like, wow, do you ever have things backwards with respect to what you're presumably really trying to achieve, which is to write, not to police the internet, and to publish and hopefully reach an audience. And in most cases, people are also interested in making some money. And just not stepping into all these traps you don't need to step into in the first place carries some risks with it. But it also actually brings with it a lot of very practical benefits. And it's important when you're thinking of being a self-published author to really think through what your attitude is going to be towards these kinds of things in advance.
Yeah.
Or learn along the way too. But I would just say that, we had one story, I can't point to the specific book, where someone saw that their book had been translated into Russian by someone who was not communicating with them about it. They'd just gone and done this. And instead of getting mad and instead of hiring a team of lawyers, the author of the book contacted the translator, who essentially pirated the book into another language and said, hey, I'm writing another book. Do you want to translate that one? Why don't we work together this time?
Mm-hmm.
And it worked out to great success for both of them. And so, the informality and the sort of accepting a bit of messiness can actually make things a lot cleaner.
Mm-hmm.
So the last question I always like to ask on this podcast of LeanPub authors is, if there was one magical feature we could build for you, or one thing that really bugs you about LeanPub that we could fix for you, what would you ask us to do?
For almost my whole workflow, I think LeanPub has been great. I imagine one thing that you've gotten before, and I know is like not a trivial thing to implement, would be like indexing.
Yeah, that's planned in the Markua spec. So for anyone listening, you write LeanPub in a flavor of Markdown called Markua. Now no, that's not exactly right. We have an old thing called LeanPub flavored Markdown, but we've replaced that with a whole new kind of Markdown for books, basically, called Markua, and it is fully specified. So we've specified how we're going to let you create indexes in books, writing in this syntax, but it's not implemented yet. So the plan is there. It's just the execution, but eventually we will have very robust support for book indexes.
Mm-hmm. I kind of feel like that's also not, with my books in particular. I've resisted print with them just because they change so often. So you can keyword search an electronic book, so it makes indexes a little less important than they were with print only. But I do have people ask about it every now and then. It's cool to know that people are thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, no, indexes can be very, very important. Particularly, I shouldn't say I don't know if I've ever seen an index. Oh, I probably have in a fiction book, but in a nonfiction book, actually, an index can be writing a good index is a whole art unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
If someone wants to look up, you can keyword search for Abraham Lincoln in an ebook, but if you can actually go to an index and look up Lincoln Abraham and then just see a structured set of pages with little descriptors of early life, pages 10 to 15, that can actually really enhance the experience of reading a book and getting what you need from it, especially if you're not going to read the whole thing and you're only there for a specific purpose.
Right.
So it's something we understand the importance of it, and we know authors do ask for it, and they have been asking for it for years, and it is something that we plan to ultimately deliver. Well, thank you, Aaron, very much for taking the time to do this interview. I really appreciate it. And thank you for using LeanPub for your books and for being a LeanPub author.
Yeah, I've been very happy all these years, so thank you.
Thanks. And thanks, as always, to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter Podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.